Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Jill Chenault. Austin Riddick was black as coal and mean as a snake. That's how the story always started. My mother would tell us the story after dinner whenever we got together with the whole family at the family house, 146 Jackson Street in Pontiac, Michigan. She would usually tell the story after we had begged her a lot and after we had cleared the dinner dishes. 146 Jackson Street was the hub of our family. Anything worth celebrating, we celebrated there. Everybody in my grandmother's generation had lived there at one time or another. And most of my life, my great aunts lived there, Aunt Maribel and Aunt Hortense. Austin Riddick, black as coal, mean as a snake, was from Coffeyville, Mississippi, and he was the smartest man in town, black or white. Austin had a very good job. He worked for the United States Postal Service, and he worked as a census taker for the county. But the most interesting job that he had was as the unofficial letter writer for the town of Coffeyville. See, Austin could read and write better than anybody in town. So if somebody got a letter and they needed help understanding it, they would take it to his house, give him a little change, and he would read it to them. Same if they needed something written. And Austin needed every penny because he and his wife had 5 children. Her name was Bertha Virginia, but everybody called her Buff. They had fallen in love and gotten married and had the same goals that most couples have when they get married: to love and care for each other, to have a family, and to grow old together. Now that have a family part got off to a bang because they started out with twins, a boy and a girl. The twins had just started walking when Austin beat Buff for the first time. He begged her forgiveness, promised he would never do it again. And then came the next baby, and they fell into a pattern. And when the children were old enough in Austin's eyes, he beat them too. All but one, the youngest, a girl. The first time he raised his hand to hit her, she didn't even flinch. She stood her ground, and she said, "You better not hit me, you black son of a bitch." And he never did. From then on, she was his favorite. In fact, when they were all grown, all of Buff's and Austin's children were grown, they still said that she was the favorite, and she was the mean one. One day, Buff decided that she and her children had taken the last beating. She got the shotgun from behind the front door and invited him to leave. Austin left. He went and lived with his sister in the next town over. But in spite of how mean he was, his children adored him, absolutely adored him. Eventually, Buff agreed to let them visit him at his sister's house as long as the sister was there. But Austin lied. His sister wasn't always there, and he still beat those children. But they didn't tell their mother because they knew that she would never let them see him again. Either that or she would kill him. Austin, during his time living away from the family, continued to write letters, but some of those letters were threatening letters to his wife and children. Using his flowery language and really beautiful cursive writing, he would write that someday he would gently place his hands around her throat and gently squeeze the life from her, slowly. The kids grew up, and the Great Migration came. The 3 older children moved north to Pontiac, Michigan. They got jobs, they worked, they saved, and they wrote back to their mother trying to get her to come north too. Now, the North did not keep its promises of freedom from night riders and fairness, but it was better than Mississippi. So eventually, Buff moved to Pontiac with her 2 youngest daughters so they could finish high school up north. She worked in white folks' homes like most of the thousands and thousands of black women who moved north. She worked as a domestic. Years later, she would tell her granddaughters, "Don't ever work in white people's homes. You'll spend half your time running from him and the other half trying to please her, which is impossible. So if you got to go over to Benton Harbor and pick berries for a living, you do that. She saved and worked, and eventually she bought her own house. She lived in that house with her youngest daughter, and one of her middle daughter came back to live with her 2 babies too. They were 3 years old and 18 months old, and they were Buff's first grandchildren. One day in 1927, Austin showed up at Buff's house. He rang the doorbell like he was a welcome guest. And we can't be sure, but we think that the youngest girl, his favorite, the mean one, must have let him into the house. And he came in talking about how they were still family no matter what, and he needed their help. Because, you see, he had invested a lot of his money in the stock market, and he was flat broke. Well, his wife and daughters told him to leave. They said no, they didn't have to help him. And he started kicking up sand, and he acted so crazy that finally Buff called her son-in-law. See, her oldest daughter lived nearby, and she had married a man who was the first black Oakland County sheriff. They called him Big Sam. Well, she called Big Sam, and Big Sam came over with his pistol and told Austin that he had to leave. Well, Austin kept on acting a fool, so Big Sam hauled him away. He served 30 days in jail. The judge told him that as soon as he got out of jail, he was to leave Pontiac immediately. But y'all know he didn't do that. The day he got out of jail, he went right back to Buff's house. He hid in the shed out back and waited until it got dark. Then he took off his shoes and he sneaked over to the side of the house. The only people in the house were Buff, her middle daughter, and her 2 grandbabies, the little girls, 3 and 18 months. He broke through a basement window to get into the house. And as soon as she heard that glass shatter, Buff knew exactly who it was. So she and her daughter barricaded themselves in the bedroom with the babies. And Buff jumped out a 2nd floor window to run and get help. She was in her night clothes, and she was running from one neighbor's house to the next, banging on the doors and pleading for somebody to help her and let her in. The only person who let her in was Minerva Johnson. They called her Nerve. Nerve told her husband to call the police while she and Buff ran back to the house. But by the time they got there, all hell had broken loose. Austin had gotten an axe from the basement. He went upstairs, he hacked his way into that bedroom, and he hit his daughter on top of the head so he could get at her babies. Then he took that axe and he bludgeoned both of them. He broke baby Vivian's back. He fractured baby Phyllis's skull. But by the time Buff and Nerve got back to the house, Austin Riddick lay dead in the backyard. See, it seemed that once he was finished with all the carnage, he realized what a terrible thing he had done, and so he stabbed himself in the chest repeatedly, and he died. The girls were in hospital for weeks and weeks. The only hospital that would treat colored children. And when they were ready to come home, Buff sent for her younger cousin back in Mississippi to come up and help her take care of them. For weeks, the cousin, Buff, and her daughter tried to scrub the blood out of the rugs in the house, but it never budged. When people around town would ask Buff how she could continue to live in a house where something so terrible had happened, she said that she had scrubbed too many white folks' toilets to let some crazy nigga run her out of her house. I loved hearing that story when I was a kid. But by the time I was 17, I had thought about it enough to have a few questions. I asked my mother whether she thought that Buff or Nerve or the youngest daughter had killed Austin, and my mother said, "Don't you ever ask me that question again." As I matured, I decided to follow up on my questions, and the first thing I did was go and get Austin's death certificate. It did say that he committed suicide, but it didn't say anything about stabbing. It said that his throat was slit with a razor. I also found a newspaper article that said that contrary to what my mother had always told me, the youngest daughter, the mean one, she wasn't out of town like my mom had always said. She was right there in the house. She was 18 years old, and she was the mean one. I sent copies of the death certificate and the article to my mother, and to this day, this was 30 years ago that I sent them to her. That's proof to me. But to this day, my mother says that she believes that Austin committed suicide. She said it this very morning when I was getting ready to come here. All my mother knows is what her mother and grandmother told her. She wasn't even born when all these events took place. And all I knew was what my mother had told me. Is it human nature to alter the facts of a very painful and difficult situation so that it's less painful for your loved ones, especially the ones that are younger than you? If you do alter those facts so that it's easier to tell, is that a lie? I mean, what is a lie? And how many lies you got to tell before you're a liar? I am certainly not saying that my great-grandmother and her mother were telling my mother a lie. And I'm sure not saying that my mother is lying. I'm still kind of scared of her. But what I am saying is it would be hard for any grandmother to tell her granddaughter that she slit the throat of her husband and then she and her friend and youngest daughter dragged him outside. See, by then, I had asked my mother one day why Austin had the same last name as Aunt Hortense. My mother just shook her head and said, I don't know why we're spending all this money on your education, because clearly you don't have good sense. Austin Riddick was my great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather, and the father of my great-aunt Hortense. When I first found this out, I was just dumbfounded. But then my mother told me that all of these events with the axe and the bludgeoning took place at 146, where she had told me the story all those years. We were sitting right there. Aunt Hortense was usually in the next room. I asked my mother, well, why didn't she say anything? And initially my mother wouldn't answer. But then I said, but Aunt Vivian, her daughter, and Aunt Phyllis, her other daughter, they're here too. We just had dinner. Then my mother said, well, if it happened to you, would you want to talk about it? It happened, we know it happened, and they don't need to talk about it. So I left it alone. Then I got all the proof, and then I was confronted with a larger question. As a real live grown-up, I wanted to add flesh and blood to the story. I not only wanted to know exactly what happened, but why it happened. I mean, nobody is all good or all evil. I wanted to understand Austin Riddick. So I talked to the only two family members who would talk to me about it, the only two who were still alive, who would talk to me about it, my Aunt Billy and Aunt Elizabeth. And what I learned was, as the town letter writer, Austin Riddick was privy to everybody's business, whether he wanted to know it or not, everybody's grief, whether he wanted it or not. And that was a burden for him to carry. All the while, he's working for the post office, working for the county, and he's expecting the federal government that he works for to protect him from harm, or at least treat him fairly. But the United States government failed to do that. In fact, the United States government turned a blind eye for all the rapes and lynchings and burnings that were being committed at that time. And that was a betrayal of Austin. It was not the promise that the United States had made that he was free and that all men are created equal. Not the promise of the law that he was a full citizen and that he was a full person, not a fraction of a person. Well, I say all this not to excuse what he did, but because I want to understand it. We can't solve any problem without first understanding it. Now, America as a whole has been always violent. It's founded on violence. It's founded on stealing. It's founded on taking what is not yours. And in order to address any of our current problems, we have got to acknowledge those truths. I am always encouraged by the strength of my predecessors, but I had to confront some difficult truths in order to get there. History, whether learned at the kitchen table or learned in school, has helped us to understand that this country can move in the right direction, move toward keeping its promises. But in order for it to do so, it has to confront the fact that it is and has always been a hateful, racist country. I also took away from this entire story that the black women in my family have had to wrestle with some serious obstacles and threats, but they handled it. Now, I'm not saying that everybody got to have a dead body in the backyard. But it is encouraging to me and should be encouraging to most of the people here, if not all of the people here, that that is simply fact. Black women have been dealing with that kind of foolishness since we got here. Those who want to do away with critical race theory want to whitewash America's past. They want to whitewash my family's past and erase that, when in fact, black women have a unique perspective on the history of this country. It ain't going so well right now. Hasn't been going so well for a while, not just for us, but for everybody. In order to make changes, sometimes we can't always fight the big fight. We have to fight the little fights. My Aunt Vivian, the one whose back was broken with an axe that night, she went on to be a very good pianist. In fact, she traveled the world as a concert pianist. She taught at Howard University, and she sued the American Girl Scouts to make them admit her little black daughter to the chapter closest to their house. Her sister, my Aunt Phyllis, she ended up being a reporter, a news reporter, and she wrote a lot about the things that we could do to get the rights that are guaranteed to us under the Constitution. We, black women, are the ones who fought for anti-lynching laws and wrote about it so the whole world would know our plight. We fought for the Voting Rights Act. We put President Obama in office. And when the backlash president, that orange fool, was in office, we gave him hell every day, and we prevented him from getting a second term. We are at the forefront of trying to prevent this country from disenfranchising black people. We, one of us that we should be especially proud of right now, a black woman recently in Memphis saw to it that the police officers who killed Tyree Nichols were fired and charged before his body was dead in the ground. We did that. So, those of us who want to see this country move forward and live up to its promises need to acknowledge the fact that black women need to be at the forefront of that fight. We are not trying to be hateful toward anybody. CRT isn't about that. It's not about hating anybody. It's not about seeking revenge. If revenge was what we wanted, the streets would have been littered with dead white people long ago. But that's not who we are. Who we are is leaders. Who we are is fighters. So, anybody who wants to make some positive change, follow us. We get things done. Thank you.
Chenault. We get things done.